Okay, I want you to try a quick mental exercise with me, just for a second. Close your eyes and picture the map of the Middle East you learned in school.
The standard one.
The standard one, exactly. You've got the Mediterranean up north, the Red Sea kind of splitting everything, and then way, way down in the Arabian Peninsula, there's this one dot, Mecca.
The center of the world for the 7th century, or at least that's the story we've all been told, the cradle of Islamic history.
Right, and in that standard narrative, that dot, it's basically an island. It's totally isolated from the huge empires of the day.
Oh, completely. The Romans, the Byzantines, they're way up north. The Persians, the Sassanids, they're off to the east.
And the Prophet Muhammad is supposedly operating in this vacuum. He's dealing with local tribal politics far, far away from the geopolitical crossfire.
That is the established history. It's what you'll find in, well, pretty much every textbook from Cairo to California. It paints this picture of a very localized religious event that only later, spilled out into the world.
Okay, now open your eyes. Imagine someone came along and told you that that entire map is, well, it's skewed.
Mm-hmm.
Imagine there was a kind of glitch in the matrix. What if all those events you thought happened in the deep desert? What if they actually took place hundreds of miles north of there? What if the Holy Land in the texts isn't where our modern maps say it is?
That's a very disorienting thought. You're asking people to physically shift the entire stage of prophetic history northward.
That's it, exactly. We're talking about a complete geographic transplant. And today, for this deep dive, we are going into a stack of research that is, and I'm not exaggerating, it's explosive.
We are.
We're looking at the work of Dr. Khaled Waleed and the Almighty Covenant Channel, and we've got a lot to go through. Manuscripts, military chronicles, but I think most importantly, we have maps.
Ancient map.
Ancient maps with names on them that, frankly, shouldn't exist if the standard story is true. Names like Bedoro and Debek Kadron.
And this is so crucial because we're not just talking about moving a dot on a map. If you move the geography, you rewrite the motive, you rewrite the entire context of the story.
You do.
Dr. Waleed's thesis, it's a fundamental reconstruction of the timeline. And the argument is that the Prophet Muhammad wasn't some remote desert preacher at all. He was a central player, a key figure in that massive world-altering war between the Byzantine and Sassanid empires.
So the mission for this deep dive is to see if that whole theory holds water. We're going to try and reconstruct the timeline based on these sources. And we're talking about, well, things like secret alliances with Roman emperors,
military strategy in the Dead Sea Basin,
and a fight for a city that the sources say wasn't Mecca, but Jerusalem.
Which the sources are very clear in identifying as Baka.
That's the linchpin, isn't it? We have to start there. When I first started going through Dr. Waleed's notes, the one thing that just stopped me cold was this distinction. Baka versus Mecca. In my head, they've always been the same thing, synonyms.
Yeah.
You read the Quran, you see the word Baka, and you just think, okay, that's the ancient name for Mecca in Saudi Arabia.
And that is the traditional exegesis, the standard interpretation. But this source material argues something radically different, that they're two distinct, even rival locations. This is the tale of two cities theory.
Wow.
And to really get the geography of prophecy, we have to separate them.
Okay, so break that down for us. If they're not the same place, then where are they and why? Why does it matter so much?
Let's look at the linguistics and the geography that the research provides. So first, Baka. The source argues that Baka is Jerusalem.
Jerusalem.
Specifically the sanctuary, the Al-Masjid al-Haram. The root of the word and the context of it being the first house appointed for mankind, it all points to that ancient Abrahamic sanctuary.
The Temple Mount.
The Temple Mount, correct. The City of Peace, or Dar al-Salam.
Right.
Now, you contrast that with Mecca.
Right.
The Quran does mention Mecca. It specifically calls it al-Qura.
The mother of villages.
The mother of villages. Traditional history places this in the Hijaz, in modern Saudi Arabia. But Dr. Waleed's research points somewhere else entirely. It points to Petra.
Petra. In Jordan. The Rose City, carved into the rock.
The very same. The argument is that Petra was the real religious and commercial hub for the pagan Arab tribes at the time.
So not Mecca.
Not the Mecca and the Hijaz, no. The claim is that Petra was the center of the polytheistic pilgrimage. It had the other Kaaba, so to speak. It was the true mother of villages because it was a huge metropolis for the region.
Right.
unlike the Mecca in Saudi Arabia, which, according to archaeological records, was barely even a hamlet at that point in history.
So the whole dynamic shifts. It's not prophet versus his local tribe in a small town. It's Jerusalem, the holy sanctuary, versus Petra, the pagan capital.
Precisely. It sets up this north-south axis of conflict right there in the Levant instead of a localized squabble in the deep desert. It puts the prophet right in the middle of all the major trade routes and, crucially, the military highways of the ancient world.
Okay, that is a bold claim, but bold claims need evidence. I want to bring up the maps.
Yes.
In the dossier we have, there's this one specific ancient map of Jerusalem. And right there, clear as day, near the Valley of Jehoshaphat, there's a label that just jumped out at me. Debek Kedron.
Debek Kedron. This is a critical piece of the puzzle.
Yeah.
The Valley of Jehoshaphat is the Kidron Valley, right? It runs right along the eastern wall of the Temple Mount in Jerusalem.
Okay.
The source links Debek phonetically and linguistically to Baka.
So, the Brook of Baka.
Exactly. The phonetic shift from a D sound to a B sound, Debek to Baka, is linguistically very sound in Semitic roots. So if you have a map from that period labeling the valley that leads right to the sanctuary as Debek or Baka,
And the Quran calls the site of the sanctuary Baka.
then the geographic lock becomes incredibly tight. It suggests Baka isn't some lost city name. It's a description of the topography of Jerusalem's holy basin.
And it doesn't stop there. The sources also talk about the plain of Morah.
Yes, and this is about the Hajj rituals, Safa and Marwa. Traditionally, we're told these are two small hills in Saudi Arabia.
Right, near the Kaaba there.
But the source points to ancient maps of Palestine and Jordan that show a plain of Morah. They connect this directly to Al-Marwa. The argument here is that the ritual of walking between Safa and Marwa is actually a commemoration of movement between massive geographic landmarks in the Holy Land.
So like Mount Moriah and the plains around it.
Exactly. It scales the whole thing up. Instead of a short run between two little hills, it implies a journey across a vast biblical landscape.
It's a totally different scale.
Yeah.
But let's get to the science, because, linguistics can be debated, but geology is a lot harder to argue with. We have to talk about this Adna Allard enigma.
This is probably the most, let's say, hard science aspect of Dr. Waleed's argument. It all centers on Surah Ar-Rum, verses 1 through 3.
Okay.
The verse reads, "The Romans have been defeated in Adna al-Ard."
Right, and I've always read that translation as in the nearest land. Adam means near, right?
It does mean near, but the root word for Adna also means low, as in elevation, the lowest land.
The lowest land.
And the source emphasizes a geological fact that would have been, well, impossible to know in the 7th century, but is common knowledge for us today. The Dead Sea Basin is the absolute lowest point of dry land on the face of the earth.
So we're talking about that huge depression in the Earth's crust, right, between Jordan and Palestine.
Exactly. It sits at approximately 411 meters below sea level, negative 411.
And this is where the source dives into it honestly looks like a mathematical code.
It's a statistical anomaly, to put it mildly. Look at the numbers. The depth of the Dead Sea is 411 meters.
Okay.
Now think about the Quran. The water capacity of the Dead Sea, its maximum volume, is calculated at roughly 114 cubic kilometers.
114, that's the number of surahs, the chapters in the Quran.
Precisely. And the depth, 411 meters, is the reverse of 114. The source points out that the verses describing this Roman defeat in the lowest land are verses 2 and 3 of the surah. When you look at the structure, the numbers just lock together in this incredible way.
Wow.
Dr. Waleed argues this cannot be a coincidence. It's a geographic coordinate system. The Quran is, in effect, pinpointing the Dead Sea Basin as the specific site of the Roman defeat.
And historically, is that accurate? Did the Romans lose a battle there?
It is dead on. In the year 614 CE, the Persians, the Sassanids, crushed the Byzantine Romans in this exact region. They swept through the Levant, smashed the defenses around the Dead Sea, and went on to take Jerusalem.
So if the Quran is identifying the Dead Sea as the location of this huge defeat, and it's calling it Adna al-Ard, it implies the prophet was very aware of this specific geography.
More than just aware. The source argues he was there. Living there. The standard history says the prophet was in Mecca, hundreds of miles to the south, maybe hearing rumors of some big war up north. But Dr. Waleed's thesis is that the prophet was living in this Adna al-Ard region. He was in the buffer zone, right between the two colliding superpowers.
That changes the hijra completely, the migration.
It changes everything.
Yeah.
And that really moves us into the timeline, because if the geography is the where, the timeline is the when. and more importantly, the why.
Okay, let's try to reconstruct this. In the standard history, the period from 610 to 620 CE is the early Meccan period, right? Persecution by the Quraysh tribe, secret preaching.
Right, a very local story.
But the source says, no, forget that for a second. Look at the geopolitical map. It says 614 CE is the year the world broke.
614 CE is the Sassanid conquest of Jerusalem, and this was a cataclysmic event. General Shahrbaraz, leading the Persian armies, he allied with local Jewish proxy militias. The sources name a leader, a man named Nehemiah ben Hushiel. Together, they breached the city's walls.
And the source identifies these militias as the Gog and Magog factions.
Yes, and this is a hugely important reinterpretation. In Dr. Waleed's reading, Gog and Magog, or Yajuj and Majuj, they aren't some mythical monsters behind a wall. No, they're specific political and tribal factions. In this context, corrupt elements of Bani Israel and polytheist tribes who allied themselves with the Persian Empire.
And when they took Jerusalem,
it was a slaughter. They massacred tens of thousands of Christians, they destroyed churches, and they stole the most sacred relic in Christendom, the true cross.
And the source is claiming that this massive geopolitical disaster,
right,
that is the context for the prophet's expulsion.
Exactly. The argument is that the prophet, who would have been about 44 years old, was expelled from Bakka, from Jerusalem, during this invasion. He wasn't fleeing because his uncle died or because some local tribes were giving him a hard time.
He was a refugee of war.
He was a refugee of war. He and his followers, the believers, were pushed out by a hostile empire that had just conquered their holy sanctuary.
That raises the stakes incredibly high. It's no longer a local dispute. It's an imperial occupation.
And that leads directly to the most controversial part of this whole thesis, the alliance.
The alliance.
Think about it. If you are Mohammed, and you have just been kicked out of your holy city by fire-worshipping Persians and their proxies, who is your natural ally in the world?
The enemy of my enemy?
The enemy of your enemy. The Romans. The Byzantines.
Whoa.
The source posits a direct coordination, maybe even a covert alliance, between Muhammad and the Byzantine emperor, Heraclius.
Hold on. In the traditional history, Heraclius is this, distant figure. He gets a letter from the prophet, asks a few questions about him, and then kind of fades out of the story.
The source completely flips that on its head. It argues Heraclius was a Nasar.
It
means a helper, a supporter, a vital strategic partner. The Quran actually refers to the Romans as believers in the context of this war. They are people of the book. They're monotheists, Trinitarian, sure, but a lot closer than Zoroastrians.
Okay.
The source suggests that Muhammad and Heraclius coordinated their efforts to retake the Holy Land from the Persians.
So when the Quran says in Surah Ar-Rum, the Romans have been defeated, but in a few years they will be victorious, that's not just a passive prediction. It's a war plan.
It's a rallying cry. It's a promise of a strategic counteroffensive. And just look at the dates. Heraclius launches his massive, history-changing counterattack against Persia around 622 CE.
622 CE, that's the year of the Hijra, the start of the Islamic calendar.
Exactly. The source argues the Hijri calendar doesn't mark some passive trek through the desert. It marks the Qada Amir al-Muminin, the decisive mobilization. It aligns perfectly with Heraclius, moving his entire army into position to flank the Persians from the north.
So the migration was actually a military maneuver.
It was a strategic repositioning to a secure base of operations from which they could support the Roman counterattack.
So the victory promised in the Quran isn't just spiritual. It all culminates in 627 CE.
The Battle of Nineveh. This is where Heraclius completely breaks the spine of the Sassanid army. The source argues that this Byzantine victory is the victory of the believers. They were two fronts of the exact same war.
This just completely reframes the prophet's role, doesn't it? He's not just watching history from the sidelines. He's actively making it alongside one of the world's superpowers.
Yes.
Which brings us to the battles. Because if the prophet is fighting in this war, then the battles of Badr, Uhud, and the Trench, they can't just be little skirmishes in the sand.
They have to be strategic military operations located in the Levant. This is where that geography we talked about earlier becomes tactical. If you're operating in the Jordan and Palestine area, the locations of your battles have to shift to match that terrain.
Okay, let's go back to that map, the Badr map.
Yes, the map that showed a specific location near the Dead Sea.
Right.
The source identifies a site labeled Badoro, very close to Jericho, and the shores of the Dead Sea. Dr. Waleed argues this is the historical Badr.
But why would Badr be there?
Think strategically. Think about supply lines. The Persians and their proxies are holding Jerusalem and all the high ground. The believers are operating from the lowest land, the Dead Sea Rift Valley. Badir, in this theory, was a battle for control of the lisan.
The lisan.
It's Arabic for tongue. It's the tongue of land that extends out into the Dead Sea. It's a natural choke point, a strategic crossing.
So it wasn't about raiding a caravan for some goods. It was about cutting off a military supply route.
Precisely. The source analyzes the Quranic description of the two hosts meeting. It describes a clash between the believers, who were Byzantine allies, and the Persian proxies stationed in that area, and the terrain described in the Quran, the near bank and the far bank. It fits the topography of the Jordan Rift Valley perfectly, where water and steep banks define any battlefield.
Okay, so they secure the low ground, the Rift Valley, at Badir in 623 CE. What's next? What about Uhud, the Battle of the Mountain?
The source calls this the Battle of the Belly of Mecca. But remember, in this theory, Mecca is Petra.
Right, Petra is the enemy capital.
So this battle, which took place in 624 CE, the source interprets Uhud not just as a mountain, but as a specific military incursion into the belly, the heartland of Petra.
The objective being
to sever the supply lines of the Gog and the Gog establishment that was headquartered there.
it's an offensive move. They're not just defending, they are taking the fight directly to the enemy's doorstep.
Yes, and you can see the progression, right? First, they secure the low ground at Gadir. Then they strike the enemy capital at Petra, or Uhud. And then in 625 CE, you have the Battle of Hunain.
Humain.
The source locates this at a place called Hanina,
Hanina. That sounds a lot like Beit Hanina.
which is a very well-known ancient village just north of Jerusalem.
So they're getting closer and closer to the city.
That is the narrative arc. They are tightening the noose around the occupied city of Bakka, which is Jerusalem. The battle at Hanina secured the northern approach. They are systematically isolating the Persian garrison inside Jerusalem.
And this all builds to the climax. 627 CE, the opening, Fath Bakka.
This is it. This is the big one. In standard history, we learn about the opening of Mecca. But Dr. Waleed argues that's a historical revision. The actual historical event was the opening of Jerusalem.
And the timing, it aligns with the Romans' victory.
It aligns perfectly. In late 627 CE, Heraclius crushes the main Persian army at the Battle of Nineveh. The Persian grip on the entire Levant just collapses. Their local proxies are left totally exposed.
And that creates the window.
It creates a window for the prophet to enter Jerusalem.
Let's imagine that scene. The occupation is broken. The believers enter the sanctuary, the Masjid al-Haram in Jerusalem, victorious.
And the source connects this moment directly to Surah Al-Fath. The verse says, "You shall enter the sacred mosque, if God wills, in security, with your heads shaved." The argument is that this vision was fulfilled right there in Jerusalem. They restored the rights of Abraham in their original intended place. They cleansed the sanctuary of the idols and the Persian fire altars.
That's an incredibly cinematic image. But history is always messy, isn't it? It couldn't have just ended there. What about the Treaty of Hudaybiyah? We usually hear about that happening before the conquest.
Right, and this is another crucial chronological correction in the source material. Dr. Waleed places the Treaty of Hudaybiyah in the year 628 CE, which is after the initial entry into Jerusalem.
That completely flips the logic. Why would you sign a treaty if you already hold the city?
Because you don't control the entire land yet. The believers held Jerusalem, Bakka. But the hostile factions, the polytheists, the remnants of the Persian allies, they had retreated south. They were regrouping towards Petra and Hebron.
So the treaty wasn't a surrender.
Not at all. The source locates al-Hudaybiyah at a place called Hadab, specifically an area known as Hadab al-Fawar near Hebron.
And Hebron is south of Jerusalem, so it's a border treaty.
That's exactly what it was. It was a ceasefire line. The Treaty of Hadab established a formal border between the liberated zone around Jerusalem and the remaining hostile territories to the south. It allowed for things like the safe passage of refugees, the Qurashi refugees, to return to their homes in the liberated lands. It wasn't a humiliation. It was a geopolitical stabilization pact.
And where is Heraclius in all of this? Is he still in the picture?
Oh, very much so. The source notes that Heraclius himself officially traveled to Jerusalem to return the true cross around the years 629 or 630 CE.
So after the treaty.
Yes. The source sees this as the absolute culmination of the alliance. The emperor and the prophet, or at least his representatives, potentially sharing the stage of a liberated Jerusalem. The city is secure. The sacred symbols of the faith are returned. It's a moment of triumph for the alliance.
But the war wasn't completely over, was it? We still have the Battle of the Trench, the day of Al-Azab, the Confederates.
And this is where the source completely radically diverges from the traditional timeline. Usually the Battle of the Trench is presented as an early defensive battle near Medina.
Right.
Dr. Waleed places it much later, around 632 or 633 CE.
That's years after the liberation of Jerusalem.
Yes, because the enemies didn't just give up. The Ahzab, the Confederates, were a massive coalition. The remnants of the Persians, the Gog and Magog, Jewish factions, various Arab tribes, they all came together for one last, desperate, massive counterattack to try and retake Jerusalem.
So the famous trench. It wasn't a ditch dug in the sand around a small settlement. It was the siege of a great walled city.
Exactly. And the details in the source for this are, they're pretty chilling. It talks about the
Saradib.
tunnels, basements. The source describes a betrayal from within the walls of Jerusalem. It says the hypocrites inside the city opened up these tunnels, the Saradib, to let enemy commandos inside the city. It speaks of enemies scaling the walls from the lowest and highest points simultaneously.
It sounds like a scene from a movie, like the siege of Minas Tirith or something.
There's an existential threat. Surah Al-Ahzab describes the absolute terror of that moment, eyes rolling, hearts reaching throats. It wasn't a simple standoff. It was a full-blown panic. The city was almost lost.
But they held on.
They held on. The source credits a miraculous defense aided by angelic hosts, which could be interpreted as a sudden, violent storm or some other divine intervention. And crucially, the ongoing support of the Byzantine military machine. This was the final stand. The defeat of the Ahzab broke the coalition for good.
This timeline, I mean, it pushes everything forward so much. If that siege was in 633 CE, then the prophet couldn't have died in 632 CE, like we're always told.
And that is the final major piece of the chronological puzzle. Dr. Waleed explicitly argues for a revised death date for the prophet, the year 644 CE.
644? That's a 12-year difference, a whole 12 years. Where did they go?
The source argues they were erased, deliberately edited out of the historical record to fit the new narrative that was created later. But historically, the year 644 CE is hugely significant.
Why?
It's the year Emperor Heraclius died. It's the year the great general Khaled ibn Waleed died. And it marks the final total collapse of the Sassanid Empire. The source argues that the prophet lived to see the mission completed in its absolute entirety. He saw the kingdom of God fully established in the Holy Land.
You know, you can rewrite dates on a piece of parchment, you can change names in a chronicle, but physical objects, they're a lot harder to lie about. We talked about the maps, but the source also highlights coins, numismatics.
Coins are like the newspapers of the ancient world, aren't they? They tell you exactly who was in charge and what they believed in. And the source points to a whole series of coins minted in the Levant during this disputed period. There's one specific coin that shows a figure interpreted as the prophet holding a staff. But the staff looks like a cross.
A cross. That seems incredibly contradictory to Islamic theology.
It does, but not if you understand the context of the alliance and the shared symbology of the time. The source doesn't call it a Christian cross. It calls it the Jerusalem cross, or the key to Jerusalem, a symbol of authority over the holy city.
Okay.
The coin also features a very distinct M shape on it.
What does the M stand for?
The source identifies it as the Gate of Mercy Bab al-Rahmah in Arabic. It represents the entry into the sanctuary. So instead of seeing this as a purely Christian Byzantine coin, the source argues it's an early believer coin, minted in Jerusalem, using shared iconography that everyone in the region would understand to denote authority.
It just blurs the lines so much, doesn't it? We like our history to be neat and tidy. Muslims over here, Christians over there. But this suggests a much more blended reality.
It was a melting pot.
Yeah.
And there's another coin the source mentions, which is fascinating. The Khazar coins.
The Khazar Empire. They were way up in the Caucasus. Right?
Exactly. And coins from this era have been found, minted by the Khazars, stamped with the phrase, Musa Rasul Allah.
Moses is the messenger of God, not Muhammad.
Right. And it highlights the incredible religious and political confusion of the era. You had Jewish factions expecting a Messiah, maybe that Nehemiah figure we mentioned earlier. You had Christians expecting the second coming of Christ. You had the believers following Mohammed.
A chaotic time.
It was. And the source argues that the very first coins bearing the name Mohammed appeared alongside all these other competing claims. It proves that the movement was born in this chaotic, Jerusalem-centric, messianic context, not in some quiet desert vacuum.
It just paints a picture of a world that is so much more interconnected than we're led to believe. It wasn't a clean break between faiths. It was a struggle for the very definition of monotheism, and it was centered on the one piece of land that mattered to all of them, Jerusalem.
And that right there is the covenant. The channel is called Almighty Covenant for a reason. The source argues that the covenant isn't just a set of religious rules. It's a geopolitical mandate.
A mandate to do what, exactly?
To hold the land, to hold Makkah. The argument is that the cursed tree mentioned in the Quran refers to the corrupt lineage of Bani Israel, those factions that had corrupted the faith and allied themselves with pagans. The cycle of history, according to Surah Al-Isra, is about their repeated corruption in the land in Jerusalem and their subsequent expulsion.
So the rise of the prophet, in this view, is about finally breaking that cycle, about reclaiming the geography of the covenant.
Exactly. It was a restoration, restoring the pure Abrahamic footprint in Makkah.
So, okay, here's the billion-dollar question. If all of this is true, if the prophet liberated Jerusalem with Roman allies, if Badr was fought by the Dead Sea, then why do we have the history that we have today? Why is Mecca in the desert? Why is the timeline cut short by 12 years?
The source points the finger directly at the Abbasids.
The dynasty that overthrew the Umayyads, what, about 100 years later?
Right. The Abbasids had their power base in the east, in the former Persian territories. They built Baghdad, and they hated the Umayyads, whose capital and power base was in Damascus and Jerusalem. The argument is that the Abbasids systematically rewrote the history to shift the entire theater of operations away from the Levant, which was the Umayyad stronghold, and move it down into the neutral, empty Arabian desert.
They moved the map to move the legitimacy.
And to sever the crucial link with the Romans. The Abbasids were constantly at war with the Byzantines. They could not have a foundational history that said, actually, our prophet and the Roman emperor were allies. So they created a new narrative.
A narrative where the Romans were always the enemy.
The Romans were always the enemy, the desert was always the home, and Jerusalem was secondary.
That is a devastating idea. It implies that so much of the history we take for granted is essentially Abbasid propaganda, designed specifically to distance the faith from its biblical Jerusalem-centric roots.
History is written by the victors, as the old saying goes. But Dr. Khaled Waleed's work reminds us of a much more fundamental truth.
What's that?
Geography doesn't lie.
You can burn the books, but you can't move the Dead Sea.
You cannot change the fact that it is 411 meters deep. You can't erase the name Badoro from a 16th century map if it's there. You can't unmint the coins that have been found in the ground.
It really makes you look at the present day in a different light. The source mentions something about history being cyclical.
It does. Surah Al-Isra, the one about the covenant, speaks of these cycles of corruption and promise. And the source suggests that if the events of the 7th century were about liberating Jerusalem from a corrupt, exclusive establishment in order to open it up to the true servants of God, well, perhaps we're living in a similar cycle today.
The same geography, the same fundamental tensions.
It's the same lowest land.
Wow. Okay. I think I need to take a breath. We have gone from a simple glitch in the matrix to a full-blown rewrite of the entire map of the Middle East.
It challenges us to be critical, doesn't it? To look at the primary sources, the coins, the stones, the maps themselves, and ask a very simple question. Does the story I've been told match the ground beneath my feet?
And that map, that Badoro map, I think I'm going to be staring at that for a very long time.
It's a stubborn piece of evidence. It's hard to ignore once you've seen it.
Well, for everyone listening, we really hope this deep dive has given you a lot to think about. Whether you accept the thesis or not, you have to admit, the idea that the geography of prophecy is etched into the very stones and salt of the Dead Sea it's just captivating.
It certainly opens a door that, once opened, is very hard to close.
Dr. Khaled Waleed's research is definitely a rabbit hole worth exploring. Thank you so much for guiding us through all these layers.
My pleasure. It's always worth checking the map one more time.
Absolutely. Until our next deep dive, keep digging, keep questioning, and maybe, just maybe, check the coordinates.